Thank you. Thank you for coming out today. You saw the video with us trying to destroy the tax code. We've actually come up with one other way. We've shot it with a shotgun, we shot it with an AR-15 and a 9mm, and it lives still. And this is the real problem. Many people will come to town and they will say, well, American jobs, what are we going to do about American jobs? We're losing American jobs. And there's some truth to that. But we have to understand where we're losing them and why we're losing them. Part of the reason is a 70,000-page tax code. It's a tax code that chases American business and American jobs overseas. It's incredibly complicated. The people who can figure it out and sort of exploit it are able sometimes to pay no taxes. The rest of us sort of in the middle are paying a lot of taxes. But the bottom line is that taxes are lower in much of the rest of the world now. If you look at, for example, our corporate income tax, it's 35%. It's now 15% in Canada. Canada, I tell people I'm embarrassed that I have to say Canada has lower taxes than us. I've spent most of my life talking about, how terrible socialized medicine is in Canada, and you wait a year for this and that, and yet we find in Canada they have lower taxes. Burger King reincorporated up there. They have a special name now for American businesses called inversions, where they go overseas and they reincorporate. We're losing those businesses to Europe and other places because, believe it or not, we have the highest taxes in the world. Add to the taxes the regulatory burden, and that's one of the reasons we're not doing very well. Another reason we're not doing very well, really, is because we borrow about $1 million a minute. We just keep adding debt after debt after debt. And you ask yourself, well, whose fault is it? Is it Republicans' fault or is it Democrats' fault? Yes. The thing is that I actually got motivated to run for office in 2008 or so because I was frustrated with Republicans adding to the debt. During the Republican administration, we doubled the debt and we doubled the size of the Department of Education. I still remember a time when it was in our Republican platform to get rid of the Department of Education. I still want to get rid of the Department of Education. So this Tea Party movement arose around 2008, 2009, and these were people who were frustrated with debt, frustrated with the size of government, and frankly frustrated that we sent Republicans to Washington and they didn't seem to listen. I tell people I don't want to be the party that is for adding debt, but just adding it a little more slowly than the Democrats do. We doubled the debt during the Republican administration. Now this president is quadrupling the debt. In fact, this president will add more to the debt than all of the previous presidents combined. So it has gotten worse, but like I say, I don't want to be the party that adds it just a little slower than the other side. I want to be the party that says, you know what, we should only spend what comes in. We bring in nearly $3 trillion, and my wife always reminds me, she says, make sure you tell people that you're not for no government. My goodness, $3 trillion is a pretty darn big government. We only spent what comes in. Certainly we could figure out how to live on just $3 trillion. But both sides are really part of the problem. The Democrats want more domestic spending, they want more welfare, but often on the Republican side, they want unlimited military spending. And is unlimited military spending the same as national defense? Not really, because I think as our debt gets bigger, we actually are weaker. Some people talk about projecting power, we need to project American might. And it's like, well, I don't think we really do that from bankruptcy court. And so we have this all of the time. People saying, we need to send our money here and send our money there. Well, what if we don't have any money to send? What if we're actually borrowing it from China to send it to other places? It makes absolutely no sense to me. But to tell you how out of touch they are in Washington compared to the general country, I introduced an amendment in the Foreign Relations Committee about a year ago, and this amendment would have said that we shouldn't send any money to countries that persecute Christians. And you're like, well, sure, that sounds like a reasonable idea. In fact, I can't imagine anybody who would oppose that among real people. But in Washington, when I introduced this amendment, and you might say, well, how do you define persecution of Christians? Well, the way we defined it was pretty simple. Any country that puts you to death or puts you in prison for life for criticizing the state religion. There's about 25 countries that there's a death penalty if you criticize the state religion. Also for interfaith marriage or for conversion. So there's about 25 countries, and you probably know what I'm talking about, that if you convert from the state religion to Christianity, you can get the death penalty. And you say, well, that never happens, right? Well, there's a woman by the name of Asia Bibi in Pakistan. She went to draw water from the well one day, and as she was drawing water from the well, the chants began. They began chanting, "Death, death to the Christian." They began beating her with sticks and stoning her. And as she lay on the ground bleeding, the police finally showed up, and she said, "Oh, I'm saved," until she figured out they were coming to arrest her for the so-called crime of blasphemy or criticizing the state religion. Why would we give money to a country that has laws like that in place? We fought a war in Afghanistan, and they instituted a constitution, and in their constitution they have the death penalty for conversion, the death penalty for criticizing the state religion. We poured more money into Afghanistan than the Marshall Plan. So really, and I don't say this to brag, but I think I'm the only conservative in the race. Because how can you be conservative if you're only for cutting off the Democrat spending, but you're not for looking at all at the military spending that's coming from the right? You're not at all for looking at the foreign aid. Almost nobody in Washington is for cutting any foreign aid. So when I said, let's just cut the foreign aid to the people who are persecuting Christians, you know what the vote was? 18-2 to continue sending the foreign aid to these countries. But if you had a public election, anywhere in the country, New Hampshire or otherwise, and you said, should we continue sending money we frankly don't have, but would you continue sending money to countries that hate us and persecute Christians? Nobody would be for that, but only in Washington. Washington is so thoroughly out of touch that continues on. When they are challenged, they say, well, we're only sending the money to the moderates so we can influence those countries. And it's like, well, how long have we been doing that? Decade after decade, and it doesn't appear to be influencing their behavior at all. In fact, we look like the world's patsies that we're going to continue giving this money hand over fist to countries that never seem to change their behavior. So I get frustrated sometimes that the people in Washington really don't represent the Republicans out in the countryside. A good example is on the taxes. I want to get rid of the whole tax code. You know what they want in Washington? And this is just the Republicans. The Democrats don't want to do anything good for lowering taxes at all. But even the Republicans, their platform is something they call revenue neutral tax reform. What does that mean? That means half of you will pay more taxes and half of you will pay less taxes, and the net effect will be zero. It'll be neutral. We won't raise or lower taxes at all for the general public. We'll just lower some of the rates, but we'll get rid of some of the other deductions, and in the end, we'll all pay the same, which means government will be the same size. I want to make government smaller. The reason I want to chop up the tax code and have one flat rate of 14.5% is because I want to starve the beast. I want government to be smaller. Let's don't feed it. Don't give them money in Washington. They're not good with money. I tell people it's not that they're inherently stupid, although it's a debatable question. They just don't get the right signals. They don't get the signals that you get. You get a definite signal. If you had no money left and you kept spending money, someone comes to collect it. If you were borrowing money to pay your mortgage, that would be outrageous. It would only last a couple of months. So the thing is that they aren't getting the same signals in Washington. So then we get fired up and we elect Republicans. So we elected Republicans to run the House, and then a couple years later we elected Republicans to run the Senate. And what has changed? Not much of anything. Why? I think it's a lack of courage. It's a lack of people willing to stand up for what they believe in. People say, well, we can't defund anything because we can't get 6 Democrats and there's only 54 Republicans and we have to get to 60 in the Senate to defund things. Well, it's really just not true. Everything is defunded at the end of a fiscal year. All spending ends at the end of a fiscal year. All you got to do is let it expire. And then you tell the other side, if you want to spend money, let's say, what are they spending money on? I'll give you a couple of examples. We spent $800,000 last year developing a televised cricket league in Afghanistan. Do you know how many people have televisions in Afghanistan? Almost nobody's got a TV there, but I don't care if they all had televisions. Why in the world would we spend $800,000 we don't have developing a televised cricket league for Afghanis to watch? We spent $250,000 on bringing 24 kids from Pakistan to space camp in Alabama. What are we thinking? But all of that goes on. If you have something called a continuing resolution, where you put all of the bills together into one big ball, and we call it a continuing resolution, no reform occurs. So I told them the other day, and I was fairly animated in my speech, I said it's a steaming pile of the same old, same old. That's what it is. No reforms, nothing. We just keep spending the money. If you don't think we waste it, here's another example. We spent a couple $100,000 studying whether or not Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous when they're on cocaine. I think we could have polled the audience, you know? We could have saved a lot of money, or as the lawyers like to say, maybe we could just stipulate that they are, all right? None of that ends, though, if you do a continuing resolution. So a continuing resolution to continue the spending is basically abdicating your duty, and it is an admission of defeat. It is preemptively announcing your defeat. We do not need 60 votes to defund anything. Everything expires at the end of the fiscal year. So we just had it September 30th, and 3/4 of the Republicans and 3/4 of the Democrats got together because it's very important for them to govern. And we hear this all the time in our private meetings. We must show the public that we are mature and that we will govern. Govern over what? The demise of our country? That's what's going on. We're spending ourselves into oblivion, but they are so frightened of the government shutting down. Well, the last time the government shut down was about 2 years ago, and it shut down for a couple weeks. But the biggest lesson to come out of it was that they were concerned that you might not notice. Seriously. When government shuts down, does it really shut down? 2/3 of your government's on autopilot. 2/3 of your government are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They go on forever. They're called mandatory spending. They are not touched ever. So then we're talking about 1/3 of the government shuts down. Well, what is the remaining 1/3? Well, half of it's the military and half of it's the domestic whatever. And so immediately within 2 or 3 days, we put forward that we should pay our soldiers, and I agree with that. So we reopened the military part. That was 1/6 of government. So really what closed? About 1/6 of government. And so they were afraid you wouldn't notice. So the president did some dramatic things. The president went out, and I'm just imagining that he had to hire 200 people, and they were unionized, I'm sure, and then he had to pay them overtime probably, to wrap the World War II monument. So the World War II monument, has anybody ever seen the World War II monument? There is no entrance or exit. It's wide open. And I actually volunteered, I will cut the grass because I like cutting grass. And so I would go and cut the grass for them. But they wrapped it with barricade after barricade so you could not go and see the World War II monument, to prove to you that you must open your government. That you have to get the government open quickly because you can't go to the World War II monument. But if you want to remember an image or think about what it's like when your government shut down, here's the image you should remember. There's a bunch of World War II veterans, 85 to 95 years old, cutting the barricades and then throwing them on the lawn at the White House. But I don't think it should be our goal to shut down government. I think our goal should be to let the spending expire and then restart government. So they always word it this way. Republicans are for shutting down the government. Republicans want dysfunction and discord and chaos. I think really you have to weigh your options. Which is worse for the country? To let government spending temporarily expire so we can actually reform it, or to keep spending it the way we are and borrowing $1 million a minute? I frankly think the biggest danger of the country is borrowing $1 million a minute, and that really we should let the spending expire. Doesn't mean I want to wait around weeks and months and do nothing. We should introduce the spending proposals. There's 12 different departments of government, and we have not passed the individual spending bills for each department of government in 10 years. We just keep bundling it together and keep spending it. But then the wasteful programs continue forever, and there is no reform. Where I differ from many in my party is that there is blame to go around, and that if you think it's conservative to have a blank check for the military, I think that's a mistake. I think you meet anybody that's been in the military, they'll tell you there's some waste in the military. In fact, John Lehman, who was the youngest Secretary of the Navy under Reagan, and a conservative that nobody will question his credentials, he said that the way we would expand and modernize the Navy is by cutting the bureaucracy within the Pentagon. He said that when he was there were 7 joint task forces, and there's now 250. So the Pentagon's like anything else. It's government, and government proliferates and bureaucracy proliferates. Doesn't mean that you're against defending the country because you don't think we should give a blank check to the military. And people say, well, they can't stand it. We're defenseless. And you hear all of this from the right of our party. But you know what? We spend more on military spending than the next 14 countries combined. So there is room for some cost savings there. And really what we're talking about is not taking a meat axe to it. We're talking about trying to slow the rate of the growth of government. In fact, if you wanted to balance government, if you wanted to balance your budget, you know what it takes? 1% cut across the board for 5 years in your budget balances. How many American families have had to deal with 1% less in income? So I think it's a very doable thing, but we're never getting there. And one of the reasons for my candidacy is you're never getting there if you put a Republican in place who has the same belief in spending for what they want as the Democrats have for what they want. Because what happens? The compromise. People think they don't compromise in Washington. Sure they do. They get together, right and left, and they all get their spending. See, this already happened. The sequester that was in place, it was gotten rid of about 2 years ago by Paul Ryan and Patty Murray coming together and getting rid of the sequester. Now they're talking about busting the budget caps so they can get more military spending, but the only way they can get it is to give the liberals more spending for welfare. So you get welfare and military spending going together, and that's why your budget continues to be out of whack. Why does this happen? Because Republicans give you lip service to balancing the budget. Every Republican in the Senate voted for a balanced budget amendment, myself included. And then I did something extraordinary. I put forward a budget that balances. So they're for a balanced budget amendment, every one of them. And the balanced budget amendment says it has to balance in 5 years. So I put forward a budget that balances in 5 years. And I got about a third of the Republican vote and no Democrats voting. So the thing is that's what you have to decide in deciding who will be your nominee if you're a Republican and you're interested in our primary is we need somebody who actually does have the courage to cut spending. And the spending has to be across the board. Everything has to have some cuts or you'll never get there. It has to be the reverse of the current compromise. The other thing we have to decide if we're going to be a party that wins again is how. I mean, New Hampshire, you guys didn't pull your weight. Last 2 times you voted for President Obama. It's all your fault, Andy. I mean, it is all your fault. I don't want to point fingers, but the thing is New Hampshire, which used to be a Republican state in presidential elections, is now could go either way. Same with Iowa. You know, we spend all this time in the Republican primary contest, but we're not talking about sometimes how do we get somebody who actually can win in the fall. And I'll tell you my proposal for how we'd win in the fall and how we'd make the party bigger. I think we need to become the party that defends the entire Bill of Rights. If you're a Republican, you hear all the time, and every candidate, all 47 of them running for the nomination, will tell you they're for the Second Amendment. And so am I. In fact, if you don't believe me, come into my house unannounced. But we have to defend the whole Bill of Rights. That means you have to defend the First Amendment, which is letting the media, even when they're wrong, 99% of the time, we have to let them have freedom of speech. Because we also want freedom to practice our religion, freedom of religious liberty as well. You have to defend the Second Amendment, but to defend all of these, you also have to have the Fourth Amendment, which means the government can't come in your house without a warrant. This means individualized suspicion, and it means a warrant signed by a judge. In fact, some people that study history would say that our founding fathers were more concerned with the Fourth Amendment than the Second Amendment. Why? Well, they couldn't conceive of anybody ever coming to take your guns, but they could conceive of somebody coming in your house because the British soldiers were coming in the house with a generalized warrant written by the soldiers. They called it a writ of assistance, but this was very offensive to the colonists. In fact, John Adams said that the spark that led to the revolution was this barging into houses with generalized warrants. It's a big deal. And some say, well, how are we going to stop terrorists? How are we going to protect ourselves? And I informed Governor Christie, I don't think he was listening, but I told him, you can protect yourself with the Fourth Amendment. Every day the police here in town, they protect the Constitution every day. Not one of your local policemen breaks the Constitution. If they are, they will be fired. If they are outside someone's house tonight and they think there's a rapist inside the house, they will call on their cell phone and ask a judge, can we go in? And it's almost always a yes. It would be the same with terrorism. As much as I am a defender of privacy, if I'm the judge, and you call me and say, well, we've got this young man who the Russians tipped us off that he might be a bomber, and he went to Chechnya last year, and he's been putting stuff on his Facebook that says he wants to murder people at the Boston Marathon, I'm for looking at his records, okay? I'm just not for looking at everyone in Boston's records or all Americans' records. I'm for spending targeted time going after terrorists, but not giving up on the very thing that we're fighting for. Don't give up on the Bill of Rights. But what I will tell you is electorally and politically, defending the Fourth Amendment, defending the right to be left alone, is something that crosses party boundaries. It attracts the youth because they do everything on their cell phone and they don't think the government should look at their records. But it also attracts independence. The Fifth and Sixth Amendment I call the Justice Amendments. And I think that the Fifth and Sixth Amendment, if we are to become a bigger party, are amendments that we need to defend. The Fifth Amendment says that your property can't be taken from you. Your property can't be taken without just compensation or due process. Well, many of us are very much offended by the Kelo decision, where the government said, or the Supreme Court said, that the government can take private property from a small property owner and give it to a big corporation. This is one of the most offensive Supreme Court decisions of the last 50 years. And yet there are some in our party, and I don't like to name names, but a certain businessman from New York with a funny hat and all that, he's going around the country saying he loves eminent domain. And he loves the fact that he can come to your town and build a corporation by uprooting people who live in their houses. One woman had enough. Vera Koking had lived in her house for 30 years, and Trump came to her town and said, you're moving. We're taking your house. And she said, the heck you are. And she actually beat him. But he's been asked as recently as the last couple of weeks, does he still support using eminent domain to take private property and give it to another one? He says, yes. I don't think that's what our party's about. And I think if enough people knew that, they would say, oh my goodness, we can't have this person as our representative. The Fifth Amendment, though, is an important part of justice. It talks about due process. The Sixth Amendment's important also. The Sixth Amendment says you have a right to a trial by jury. And you say, well, who could be against that? Certainly that's a fundamental American right, the right to have a jury trial. Who could possibly be against that? Well, in 2011, we had a debate over this. In 2011, we had a debate over something called indefinite detention. This is where an American citizen accused of a crime in America can actually be plucked off the street and actually sent to Guantanamo Bay without a trial, without a lawyer. And we were having the debate on the Senate floor. And while I don't like to name names, it was a senator from Arizona that I'm having the debate with. And I was incredulous. I said, do you think an American citizen could be sent to Guantanamo Bay without a trial? And he said, yeah, if they're dangerous. I said, it sort of begs the question, doesn't it? Who gets to decide who's dangerous and who's not? And at that moment, I was thinking of the times we've gotten it wrong in our history. I was thinking of when we arrested and rounded up 100,000 Japanese Americans just because of the way they looked. I was thinking of what we did to civil rights leaders by tapping their phones, what we did to people who protested against the Vietnam War by tapping their phones illegally. The times when we got it wrong. I was thinking of a guy named Richard Jewell. Anybody remember Richard Jewell? He was the guy they said was the Olympic bomber. Everybody said he was guilty. Within hours, his picture was all over all the news media. In fact, later on, when they found out it wasn't him, the news media had to pay him millions of dollars because he was wrongfully accused. But I was thinking of Richard Jewell, and I was thinking of how important it is when you're accused of a crime to get your day in court and not to presume guilty, not to presume someone guilty. But I was also thinking, if Richard Jewell had been a black man in the South in the 1920s, what would have happened to him? He might not have lived today. The whole idea of the Bill of Rights that should transcend all party labels, whether you're rich, poor, white, black, wherever you come from, whatever you look like, is this idea of justice. And to me, what I think is that when we become a party, when we become the party of justice, the party that will defend people against injustice, I think that's a popular idea. I think that's an inclusive idea. That's an attractive idea that people will come to our party. And I'd like to conclude with one other story of injustice in our country that I think we could make better. There was a young black kid in the Bronx by the name of Khalif Browder, and he was arrested and charged with a crime. But he was never taken to court, but he was put in prison. He went to Rikers Island, spent 3 years in Rikers Island. 2 years he was spent in solitary confinement. He was beaten by gangs, beaten by guards, but that shouldn't happen to anybody. He never was tried. He tried to commit suicide, and then finally they let him go because the person who accused him of the crime didn't even live in our country legally. They had fled by then, but it didn't help this kid. It ruined his life. And when you see people angry, in our country and you're wanting to know why they're angry, think about this kid and think about how his parents must feel or the friends of his must feel about justice in our country. But I think when we become the party that defends justice for this young man, defends the Sixth Amendment, and defends the Sixth Amendment with the same passion that we defend the Second Amendment, I think that's a party that's going to be big enough to rock and roll to victory, and that's the party I want to lead. Thank you very much. I think some of the reason why we have lost touch or lost the grasp for liberties and rights is that we've forgotten where they come from. And we think that somehow the majority grants you rights or the government grants you rights, and we've got it kind of upside down. Our rights come from our Creator, and they pre-exist all government. The great thing about the way our founding fathers set up government was it was to restrain government, to protect rights that were already yours. The Bill of Rights is incredibly important also because people get confused. They think we live in a democracy. We don't. And our founding fathers were horrified by the notion of democracy. What do I mean by that? They were horrified by the notion that a majority could take away your rights. So all the rights listed in the Bill of Rights, and it's not all of your rights, it's just some of the most important ones. That's why we have the Ninth Amendment that says those rights not listed are not to be disparaged. But I think it's really important that we understand that we live in a constitutional republic, not a democracy. And when kids come to, or adults or whoever comes to Washington, I do a quick 5 minutes with them. We take a picture. I always ask the kids to raise their hand. Do you think we're a republic or a democracy? And it's important because it gets to the foundation of whether or not your rights are yours and can they be taken away by a majority. And some of the times when we got things horribly wrong, it was because we let the majority, we believed that the majority could make decisions. So for example, the Jim Crow segregation that we had in the South, it was passed by majority legislation. And so we have to understand, and people should fundamentally understand, that majorities can't take away your rights. Your rights precede government, and the reason for government is to protect your rights and to keep government at bay. But I think we sometimes get lost into that. We think government's like American Idol, and kind of the presidential election kind of looks like that way right now, is that push a button if you prefer this at this particular moment. But I think ultimately my hope is as we go through the presidential season, people will get more serious about questions like this. I think there is a role for government in protecting the environment. And I think when we look at protecting the environment, though, we have to look at a balanced approach. The environment's important, so is the economy, and so are jobs, and so is being alive. And I think sometimes we discount sort of the benefits of technology, and we only see some opposite sort of apocalyptic future for the country, given what's going on. And I'll give you an example, is that if you look at the 10 countries that produce the most electricity, and you look at the 10 countries that produce the least amount of electricity, and as a consequence, you could say they also pollute because they make electricity, and the 10 countries that don't make any electricity don't pollute. Well, the countries that make electricity live 25 years longer. So we don't want to forget about the benefits of electricity, of being able to be inside. At least half of North America had malaria at one point because we didn't have air conditioning. So there are great benefits to living in a civilized world, and we shouldn't decide all of a sudden we're just not going to have power, we're not going to have electricity. If you look at, and I think this is an important question, and I think we've had somewhat of a distortion, and some of this comes from an influence in our education that maybe has an agenda. If you ask yourself, is the environment cleaner now or in 1960? There's no, without question, it's cleaner now. If you compare our environment now to 1910, without question, it's a lot cleaner. Even if you look at EPA statistics from coal-fired plants, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, mercury, all going down. So what we have to decide when we're figuring out what regulations we want in our country is, President Obama has decided just to take the emissions to virtually zero, so there'll be no more coal-fired plants. But about 50% of your electricity comes from coal. And if we do this dramatically, there are going to be problems. The first problem you're going to see is rising prices of electricity. So poor people will be hurt more than the rest of folks, those who struggle to make their bills each month. I think that when we ask ourselves, climate, is man involved with the climate? Are you a denier or are you an acceptor? It's both. Man probably has some influence over climate, but so does nature. So all the people promoting man-made climate change, the question I want to know is how much is nature and how much is man? And can you tell me with certainty this is all man and nothing to do with nature? Before man was around, before we started burning anything, there was all these enormous changes in the climate. We had glaciers, we've had hotter times, we've had times with more carbon, less carbon. So I think we just shouldn't we shouldn't succumb to an apocalyptic version that, oh my goodness, the Statue of Liberty is drowning and stuff like this, and that some kind of cataclysmic thing is coming on. And we ought to have a balanced approach. How much of the climate change is nature and how much is man? And we should try to minimize pollution. Property rights help to minimize pollution too. If you look at some of the worst pollution over the last 50 years, it was done with the permission of government. In fact, the worst pollution in the world right now is done by the permission of totalitarian governments. Soviet Union and China are much worse polluters than we are. And if you protect property rights, you're more likely to protect people from being able to damage someone else's land. Yes, that is a great question. And the only thing I would add to your lineage of times when the government really screws up and no one's fired is 9/11. No one was fired. We gave medals to the head of the CIA and the head of the FBI after doing an abysmal job. We had the 20th hijacker a month beforehand. Nobody looked at his computer. Yet no one was ever fired over 9/11. We passed a bill to allow them to fire people over the VA scandal. I think they've fired one person now. But it gets back to, I like to talk about the two reasons why you should have small government. One is the liberty argument, and the other is the efficiency argument. The efficiency argument is what Milton Friedman said, that nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. It just goes to what you're talking about. The inefficiency and the ineptness of government is because there's not the self-interest that is involved in the marketplace. So what you should do is you should minimize government as a consequence of that. Because of all these failures that you list, that's why government should be very small and do very little. So maybe they could do some of the very little that we want them to do better. But you're right, they're not very good at anything. And as government gets bigger and bigger, and as the rules get more and more onerous, then they have to have more police coming to try to enforce them. So there are 48 federal agencies that have SWAT teams now, including the Department of Agriculture, including the Department of Education has a SWAT team. And it's funny, one of the liberal newspapers has a fact check thing, and they've been putting out that I'm wrong on this. They ask them all, do you have a SWAT team? They all said no. But if you ask them, do you have a group of people that wear body armor, helmets, and carry semi-automatic weapons? They say yes, but they just don't call them SWAT teams. But 48 federal agencies. Department of Agriculture has raided organic food stores for the crime of selling milk from the cow. So it's completely crazy. And you just need government to be smaller because they'll never be that good at anything. All right, yes. Yeah, and I think that you're right. I mean, there's probably, I know some 35-year-olds that are probably in a lot worse health than somebody who's 65. So the decision should probably be based on health. And if it's a federal government rule, you're right. Federal government shouldn't mandate it, particularly since we always have more than one pilot on board. But it is difficult making the decision because you obviously don't want someone who's having chest pain daily to be your pilot either. So, anybody else? Maybe one more? Yes. No, I'm glad you brought that up because I neglected to bring that up in my speech. And this is another decision we all have to make because it very much worries me what's going on over there. So right now you have Russia flying over Iraq and flying over Syria at the invitation of Iraq and Syria. But you have Hillary Clinton and about a half a dozen Republican presidential candidates saying, we want a no-fly zone. Realize what they're asking for, because what they're asking for is something that's absurd. They're asking for a no-fly zone in an area where someone's already flying. All right? So if Russia's already flying there and you're going to call it a no-fly zone, that means we're going to shoot down Russian fighter pilots. That is a recipe for World War III. And I think a very immature sort of understanding of what's going on over there, but very, very dangerous to all of us. But you've got Hillary Clinton and probably 5 or 6 of the Republicans calling for a no-fly zone. You have people like Carly Fiorina says she will not talk to Putin. Well, that is really, really scary, that if you want to have a leader that's not going to talk. Reagan was considered to be a great conservative leader, but he always talked to the Russians. We never sort of like closed the window and said, oh, we're not going to talk to the Russians. In fact, Reagan negotiated with Gorbachev. And some of the same people in our party, the neoconservatives, that always seem to be excited about getting involved in another war, they criticized Reagan at the time. Now they all love Reagan because they've seen how revered he is in history, but many of them were critics of Reagan for talking to Gorbachev in the first place. So I think you do and should be diplomatically engaged, even with your adversaries around the world. It's a big mistake not to talk. It's a big mistake to draw a red line in the sky and say, you cross it, we're shooting you down. It's a very, very aggressive type of foreign policy. But some people think we have to be involved everywhere. But if there's one true thing for the Middle East, I would say is that when we toppled secular dictators, there's been chaos, the rise of radical Islam, and we're more at risk. If you look at Libya, Hillary Clinton was a big proponent of toppling Gaddafi. He was a dictator, not a friend, not a great guy, wouldn't have supported him either. But once he was gone, you had chaos. Our ambassador was assassinated. The whole place is a complete mess. It's a failed state now. But Iraq is a failed state 15 years later, completely a failure. And I think we are more at risk for it becoming a terrorist breeding ground. But really, it's because Hussein's gone. Hussein wasn't a great person either, but he was a counterbalance to Iran. Iran is stronger now because Hussein is gone. You have people in our party, John McCain wants to bomb both sides of many wars. He wants to bomb Assad and ISIS simultaneously. Well, the weird thing about it we need to understand is there's 2 million Christians in Syria, and if you ask them who they support, they actually support Assad. They're deathly afraid of ISIS taking over the place. But 2 years ago, President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and many of the Republicans wanted to bomb Assad because he gassed his people. It's terrible that he gassed his people, but you have to understand what will happen if we bomb him. If we bomb Assad, I think ISIS would now be in charge of all of Syria. So I do think we have to think about our interventions and how they've often backfired, and it is something that separates me from the other Republicans. I'm fiscally conservative, as conservative or more conservative than anybody else in the Senate, but I'm also conservative when it comes to all spending, and I'm also conservative with sending our young, our sons and daughters to another war, because I think that should be the last resort, not the first. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.